Con usura no tiene el hombre casa de buena piedra. Cada bloque cortado en liso y bien adecuado para que el diseño pueda cubrir su cara. Con usura no tiene el hombre un paraíso pintado en el muro de su iglesia, harpes et lutes, donde la Virgen reciba mensaje y ya lo proyectase de incisión. Con usura el hombre no ve a Gonzaga y a sus herederos y concubinas, y ninguna pintura se hace para durar ni convivir, sino solo para venderse con premura. Con usura, pecado contra natura, tu pan es siempre mendrugo o añejo, seco como papel, sin trigo en la montaña, ni fuerte harina. Con usura, la línea se hace gruesa, con usura no hay límites precisos, y el hombre no puede hallar sitio a su morada. El que labra la piedra es sustraído a su piedra y el tejedor sustraído a su telar. Con usura, no llega lana al mercado y la oveja no trae provecho con usura. Usura es asidia, usura embota la aguja en mano de la doncella y paraliza la destreza del hilandero. Usura asesina al niño en el vientre, impide el cortejo del joven, trae apatía al lecho y yace entre la novia joven y su novio. Contra natura, han traído rameras para el Eusis, cadáveres destínanse al banquete, al mandato de usura. Con usura, un poema de Ezra Pound, 1937. En este poema aparece expresada de manera muy poética cómo la usura que está en el corazón de nuestro sistema de vida, el sistema occidental, el sistema triunfante, es destruido lo más esencial, los más esenciales de los valores humanos, la belleza, la verdad, los oficios. Hoy día vivimos una época en que es difícil pensar una alternativa a un sistema fundado sobre la usura. Y hay una mujer, Naomi Klein, que nos acompaña hoy día en una belleza nueva, que es titular de la cátedra Milliman en la London School of Economics, doctora honoris causa por el Derecho en la Universidad de King's College. Ahí alcanzó uno de los puestos más altos en el sondeo global de intelectuales, como una de las destacadas intelectuales investigadoras. Naomi Klein, a través de 2 libros, No Logo, el poder de las marcas, que tengo aquí en mis manos, y el último, La doctrina del shock, el auge del capitalismo del desastre, de alguna manera visita o investiga, profundiza sobre una de las caras de la usura, tal vez la más radical y la más violenta, la de la que ella llama el capitalismo del desastre. Muchas gracias, Naomi Klein, por estar aquí en mi programa Una Belleza Nueva. Bienvenida.
Thank you. I'm so pleased to be here.
En primer lugar, yo le leí este poema del poeta norteamericano Ezra Pound. ¿Qué siente usted ante ese poema?
Well, I think it's an important reminder that this chapter of disaster capitalism is only the most recent chapter of these destructive powers. And I think there's a tendency to always, there's a tension, I suppose, between feeling that there's nothing ever new and also the need to name what is new, and so that we have the potential to resist it a little bit.
¿Qué es lo que es el capitalismo del desastre? Si tuviéramos que brevemente definirlo. ¿Qué significa capitalismo del desastre?
Well, in the spirit of Pound, I will talk about what is old about it and also a little bit what is new about it. What I mean by disaster capitalism is the use, it's really 2 forces. The use of large-scale crises and disasters. Now, these disasters could be wars, they could be terrorist attacks, it could be natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, to push through free market policies, and I always say free market in quotes because often the market is really not that free, to use the window of opportunity that opens up after a crisis when people are scared and panicked and looking for leaders who have the answers and are father figures, to install these policies very quickly using a technique that economists often call shock therapy. So that is disaster capitalism, one kind of it. The second kind is what is new, which is the treating of the disasters themselves as a new market, as a new profit-making opportunity. So you have a growing part of the global economy that sees disasters as exciting new market opportunities to sell private policing, to reconstruct from the disasters, to sell humanitarian response. All of it a for-profit enterprise. But, you know, just to put this in historical context, the Pilgrims who settled North America saw the smallpox plague, saw that disaster as a gift from God. And if you read the diaries of the Pilgrim leaders, they talk about the smallpox plague being a gift from God to clear the land of the Indians so that it could be settled by the Pilgrims. And when I was in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, I heard something very, very similar from a right-wing politician who said that there are large public housing projects in New Orleans where poor people live. They're on very desirable pieces of real estate, just like the pieces of real estate where the Indians lived. And he said, we couldn't clean out those housing projects, but God did, meaning the hurricane. So there is certainly a historical continuity of disaster capitalism, but there's also something new, which is treating the disasters as a market.
¿Hay una suerte de trasfondo religioso en esta suerte de nuevo fundamentalismo capitalista? ¿Hay un trasfondo filosófico religioso de alguna raíz en Estados Unidos que esté detrás de este pensamiento?
Well, what we call neoliberalism, this current chapter of capital history, which most historians measure as starting in Chile in 1973 and going from Reagan and Thatcher to the Soviet Union, China. This chapter is a fundamentalist strain of capitalism because it is a counter-revolution against the mixed economies that were built in response to the Great Depression. So you had the Depression, the market crash of 1929, which was seen by many, particularly Keynes, as evidence of the impossibility of laissez-faire economics, that this was an example of why the market could not be left to its own devices, why there needed to be social programs, why there needed to be intervention. And so around the world you had the creation of mixed economies, a variety of different kinds, including in Chile. And so the neoliberal era is a fundamentalist strain that says of these mixed economies, no, we need perfect capitalism. We need to remove all the distortions. And I think that there's always a religious element to any fundamentalist movement, whether the people involved are themselves religious. They look for religious type texts that have all of the answers, all of the prescriptions. And what they share in common with religious fundamentalists, and I'm the first to say that the extreme left is just as guilty. It's the idea that whenever there is a problem, the blame is placed on an insufficient strictness in the application of the doctrine. So if free market policies create huge inequality, corruption, well, then it's just because you didn't apply the textbook, the Bible, which for the neoliberals is usually Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom, with sufficient strictness.
Para el neoliberal, o los intelectuales, o los líderes del neoliberalismo, Milton Friedman sería de alguna manera como Karl Marx para los marxistas, ¿no es así? Milton Friedman es una figura intelectual de primer nivel, muy relevante en las últimas décadas. Su pensamiento ha tenido una influencia radical en la vida de muchos pueblos. Y usted lo llama algo así como el Dr. Choc, ¿no? ¿Por qué? Hablemos un poco de este personaje, Milton Friedman, que usted lo presenta prácticamente como el protagonista, escondido detrás de todo lo que ha ocurrido en el mundo en las últimas décadas.
Well, it's complicated because he is a hugely influential figure, but I also don't subscribe to the theory of history that history is created by great men. I think Milton Friedman was a creation of historical forces, which is to say that if Milton Friedman didn't play this role, somebody else would have, in the sense that if we accept this idea that we've been living a counter-revolution against the mixed economies built between the 30s and the 60s, that particularly in the United States, Wall Street was tired of paying such high taxes, was tired of dealing with such strong unions, was frightened by the rise of socialism in the developing world. And so there needed to be an intellectual movement that would voice these, it would make an argument really as complete as Marxism. And the University of Chicago was that place and received a great deal of financing from Wall Street. So the ideas of Milton Friedman, he was really a popularizer, and he created a handbook. I mean, that's the significance, I think, of capitalism and freedom, is that it's a list. It's a list of policies that are designed to undo the policies since the Great Depression. So it's everything from privatizing pensions to eliminating national parks, really. But he was very influential, but I think he was made influential by policies of governments. For instance, the policy of the U.S. State Department to bring a group of Chilean students to the University of Chicago. But Milton Friedman was tremendously charismatic. He described himself once as a old-fashioned Sunday school preacher, and he really had that sense of preaching the truth, and he was likable. I think that his students were tremendously enthusiastic about the experience of going to his classes, because economics classes can be very boring, but by all accounts Milton Friedman's economics classes weren't boring at all. But they also had, and this phrase comes up again and again in the memories of Chicago boys, it's the logical completeness. It's that it explained everything. It was a totalizing vision that was so, in some ways, maybe relaxing.
Él amaba, usted lo describe aquí en el libro, él amaba y se enamoró alguna vez de la belleza de las matemáticas, ¿no es así? O de la lógica, de buscar alguna fórmula perfecta que fuera capaz, tal vez, de explicar o de resumir la realidad. De ahí nace, tal vez, este pensamiento económico, ¿no?
Well, absolutely. I mean, he talked about how he fell in love with math, and he talks about that moment of truth is beauty, beauty is truth. And I think this is very significant, because before the Chicago school became dominant, economics was not treated as a hard science. It was treated as a branch of political science, and it was really a social science. And the University of Chicago was filled with mathematicians. Many of them actually spoke English as a second language, and the fact that they were so good at math and they could work everything out with mathematical modeling was their advantage over the people who they dismissed as mere essay writers. And of course, the ultimate essay writer was Keynes. So it was really, it was a great passion of Milton Friedman's to treat economics as seriously as chemistry, as physics, as unfixed.
Como una ciencia.
Like a hard science, like a hard science. And of course, I think that that's quite dangerous, because economics is how we build our societies. And if it is a hard science, fixed, and as one of his colleagues, Arnold Harbinger, liked to say, that these rules were as fixed as the moon pulling the tides, then it leaves no space for democracy, right? And any attempt to shape societies is a sort of it's almost a sacrilegious distortion of this perfection that would ensue, in theory, if these forces were simply allowed to find their natural order and balance. So it does take on a religious quality.
Usted hace un recorrido de la aplicación de estas políticas de shock basadas en el modelo neoliberal de Milton Friedman, que parten en Chile. Chile sería el laboratorio inicial en el año 73, y que termina hoy día, pasando por Rusia, Bolivia, incluso China, vamos a hablar tal vez de eso, termina hoy día en Irak. Me gustaría trasladarnos a Irak. Usted ha estado en Irak, ha estado en Bagdad, que ha sido no solamente testigo, ha estudiado, pero en terreno lo que ahí ha pasado. ¿Qué es lo novedoso de la política de shock aplicada en Irak en relación a las otras políticas de shock? ¿Qué ha pasado en Irak desde esta perspectiva, desde su mirada?
Well, I think what happened in Iraq was a return, in many ways, to the violent roots of this economic campaign, in the sense that when it began in Chile, it was violent, and it was clearly undemocratic, because a democratically elected government had just been overthrown, and a government was put itself in place that openly used terror. But then there was what is often described as the peaceful period, and particularly in the 90s, neoliberalism advanced, certainly with a veneer of consent through the World Trade Organization, through free trade agreements, through International Monetary Fund, structural adjustment programs. So the policies of what used to be called the Washington Consensus were imposed through negotiation with these transnational organizations and sovereign governments. Now, I was part of the movement, which is often called anti-globalization, but is in fact a very international movement which opposed the globalization of these economic policies. And when I went to Iraq, it was because certainly something new was going on. And what was going on is that the veneer of consent with which these policies advanced in the 90s was dropped completely. Because here you had a situation where first a country was shocked with an illegal invasion that was opposed by most people in the world. The architects of the invasion chose the phrase shock and awe to describe their strategy, which was designed to heighten the disorientation of the society. The country was then looted, with the United States forces doing nothing to stop it. Very famously, Donald Rumsfeld was asked, and he said, stuff happens, about the looting of the Iraqi Museum and Library. And then Paul Bremer arrived. I remember it very well. You know, he arrived in May 2003. He liked to wear a business suit and combat boots. So in a sense, it was like a Chicago boy and a general in one man. And he passed what Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, described as the most radical economic shock therapy program ever attempted, including in Russia. He passed 100 laws all at once, making Iraq the most wide-open, unprotected economy in the world. And the significance and the change of this was that Iraq was under foreign occupation. There was no negotiation. There was no one to negotiate with. He could just write it all. You know, it's sort of like, I don't know if you have these shows.
¿Qué es lo que se destruyó en Irak? Porque da la impresión que la situación anterior era una situación tan catastrófica como la que vino después, el régimen dictatorial de Saddam Hussein. ¿Qué fue lo que destruyó Estados Unidos en la invasión? ¿Qué es lo que se arrasó para construir esta nueva economía? ¿Qué es lo que había de positivo, digamos, en el orden iraquí anterior a la invasión?
Well, look, Iraq was a mess. There's no doubt that Iraq was a mess, and a large reason why the economy was in such a state of disrepair was that it was coming out of 13 years of sanctions. But one thing that there was in Iraq was a network, and continues to be, a network of state-run factories that produced, for instance, concrete, all kinds of building materials. And what was really significant about what Paul Bremer did, and which now the U.S. military recognizes as having been a real error, was he announced that he was going to privatize all of Iraq's 200 state-owned companies. And because the plan was to privatize them, there was no point in even giving them an emergency generator so that they could turn the lights on. So what happened was that all the building materials to rebuild the country that had just been destroyed came from outside. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate in Iraq was 70%. So most analysts looking at this period see this as really the decisive decision that led to the rise of the armed Iraqi resistance. Because these economic policies, and I found this when I was in Baghdad in this period, were not seen as a reconstruction of the country. It was seen as a continuation of the war, that Iraqi industry, just as the country had just been in many ways destroyed, that Iraqi industry was now being destroyed by these imports flooding across the border, and the lights were out in Iraq's factories. So how are you supposed to compete with foreign imports if you can't even turn the lights on?
La pregunta que uno se hace al leer la historia de las últimas décadas, los dramáticos experimentos en Rusia, lo que pasó en Polonia, lo que pasó en Bolivia, la pregunta es, ¿hay alguna alternativa a un capitalismo que no sea, entre comillas, fundamentalista? ¿Cuál es la alternativa? Se lo pregunto, porque, claro, si uno mira la misma situación de Chile, la zona anterior al golpe militar, efectivamente era una democracia, pero la economía estaba destruida. Había una inflación galopante, se habían estatizado una cantidad de industrias, de privados chilenos, de empresarios chilenos que tenían estas industrias por derecho propio, que habían hecho un buen trabajo. O sea, también ahí se estaba aplicando un modelo fundamentalista, pero de línea de izquierda, estoy hablando en términos económicos. No era un modelo que funcionaba, el país no estaba bien al final. Entonces, la pregunta es, ¿cuál es la alternativa? ¿Cuál es la posibilidad de hacer un capitalismo distinto al capitalismo de shock que aplica Milton Friedman. Porque si Milton Friedman entra, si los Chicago Boys entran en estos países que usted describe, es porque ha habido un fracaso anterior. Entonces, ¿cuál es la alternativa? Esa es la gran pregunta que nos hacemos siempre. ¿Existe o no una alternativa? Esa es la pregunta. ¿Ah?
I think there is an alternative, and I
Yeah.
think it's an alternative that is systematically sabotaged by these shock policies. And it's precisely because it is so popular that people often vote for it when they have a chance, that these shock tactics need to be used to interrupt that process. You know, we're talking using this phrase fundamentalist, and I think the phrase fundamentalist does apply to the theory. But it is important to always remember that it doesn't apply to the practice in many cases. Here we are in an economic crisis in the United States, and there's a great deal of intervention on behalf of Wall Street. The Bear Stearns bailout is a dramatic example. And in Chile, you also had Codelco remaining in state hands, really funding this experiment. So I think the ideology issue is quite complicated. I think ideology is a tool to impose policies that are essentially policies of transferring public wealth into private hands. And when that private wealth needs a bailout or needs some kind of a government intervention, then we find the ideologues forgetting their own rules and being very in favor of an interventionist government. So just would start with that. But you know, I think with Chile, it's obviously a complicated situation because Allende was elected because people were unsatisfied with the current economy. But what I try to show in the book is that at each of these key junctures, there were alternatives that people were voting for, that they wanted to try. And they often did involve nationalizations. They often did involve workers' cooperatives, the idea that it's not just a choice between private and public, but that there is a third way, not the Tony Blair third way, but a third way of element in the economy that is worker-run cooperatives. And one of the great sort of propaganda points of the right is that they won because all other ideas failed. That's the Francis Fukuyama statement. The end of history, all other ideologies have been so discredited that this one rose. And if we look at Chile in the early 70s, there was actually a very clear, very well-documented campaign of sabotage, international and national sabotage, to make sure that the Allende experiment turned into a crisis before these ideas could really have a chance to flourish. And I quote a really interesting letter that I'm sure you know about that emerged much later between Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon after Allende won the election in 1970. He said that the real fear is not what they were saying publicly, which is that it's a totalitarian state in disguise. But he said the fear is the imitative spread, the fear of imitation. And he was particularly worried about Italy, imitating the idea of democratic socialism. You know, I give the example of Poland in 1989, which was the first democratically elected post-communist government. And people voted in incredible numbers and overwhelmingly for a political party called Solidarity, Solidarność. And what was Solidarity? It was a political party that stood very explicitly for this third way. Lech Walesa said that he didn't want the evils of capitalism, he didn't want the evils of communism, but something in between and something better. And the center of Solidarity's economic program was transforming the state-owned companies into workers' cooperatives. Now, did that fail? So can we say that there's no alternative? Well, we'll never know, because they never were allowed to try, because they were in such a deep crisis, and the IMF came in and they said, we'll bail you out, but only if you accept shock treatment. And that's, you know, that to me is the most important part of this research, is showing that there were alternatives, and those alternatives didn't get a chance to fail.
Ahora, es paradójico porque en Chile también está documentado que el Departamento de Estado, Estados Unidos, la CIA, habría financiado, por ejemplo, no solo a la derecha, sino que habría financiado a la Democracia Cristiana, que era un partido de centro-izquierda en ese momento, ¿no? Para combatir el gobierno de Allende. O sea, que representaba un poco estas políticas de un capitalismo intermedio, un capitalismo más social, ¿no? No sé si usted sabía eso.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, they were trying to broker a deal to prevent Allende from ever taking power, and that was a very interesting investigation. And ITT was very famously involved in trying to broker that deal. And, you know, I don't think that the State Department planned for Chile to be a laboratory for the Chicago boys. I don't think it was that explicit. I think it was a coincidence of history that because of a separate State Department program that began in the 50s, you know, these guys don't plan that far in advance, okay? And so, you know, in the 1950s, as we know, there was a concern about what the head of the U.S. State Department's Chile office called the pink economists in Santiago. He was very worried about the pink economists. And he was having a discussion with the head of the University of Chicago's economics department, and they were talking, what should we do about all of the pink economists in Santiago? And they came up with this idea of an academic program that would bring very bright students from Chile to the University of Chicago to train at what was the most sort of radical right-wing economics department in the world. And what's interesting about that, about the timing of it, is that in the 50s, University of Chicago was a completely marginal school. It was seen as really out there within the United States political discourse. But the idea was that it would be a counterbalance to socialism in Latin America. And so you had this system of what Juan Gabriel Valdez, your foreign finance minister, describes as a campaign of deliberate ideological transfer that had been going on for 20 years. And then the coup happened, and you had a group of intellectuals who were ready with their ideas.
La última pregunta que quería hacerle, Noemí, ¿cómo analiza usted la crisis actual económica que está hoy día localizada en Estados Unidos? ¿Qué es lo que hay detrás? ¿Qué es lo que está pasando ahí? ¿Cuál es su mirada y su perspectiva?
Well, I think like the market crash of 1929, this is a crisis created by deregulation. And you are even hearing that from the hedge fund managers, some of the hedge fund managers. Somebody like George Soros is saying, you know, this is what happens when you allow a system to become so complex that the regulators themselves don't even understand these new kinds of value, these new forms of money that are being created. And that's one of the things that's most shocking about this economic crisis, is hearing the people who were supposed to regulate the housing market and the hedge fund managers admit that these forms of credit that they were trading amongst themselves were too complicated for them to understand. So it is a crisis created by deregulation. It's also a crisis created by ideology, in the sense of the ideology of deregulation, but more than that. The housing market, the housing bubble, is part of what George Bush calls the ownership society, which is actually an idea that he got from a Chilean named Jose Piñera, who talked about Chile as a society of owners. And he talked about that in the context of privatizing Social Security. And the idea was that these policies, neoliberalism, the Chicago model, is too unpopular to have mass democratic support. That's the democracy problem. But the way to change that is, once you've imposed these policies, then you try to get as many people as possible with a little piece of investment in the system, a mortgage, some stocks, so that they start to change the way they think. They start to stop thinking like workers, for instance, and start identifying with the interests of owners. And the idea of giving so much cheap credit so that many, many poor people could buy homes that they couldn't afford was part of this idea of the ownership society, and that's also what collapsed. It has collapsed in the current crisis.
Noemí, yo le quiero agradecer su presencia aquí en Una Belleza Nueva. Bienvenida a Chile, un país muy hermoso que por supuesto la recibe para que visite también su belleza, aparte de ser el laboratorio de este modelo del shock que usted ha también descrito en este libro.